In this lecture, we're going to look at the cost to manufacture a product. Now, we've already looked at the three costs that are associated with manufacturing a product: direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. However, what if we have a business that manufactures more than one product? Let's consider how we might allocate or divide the costs up between the various products that we manufacture. In our business, we're manufacturing skateboards and scooters. So we manufacture just basically two products to keep it simple. So like with any manufacturing business, we have three major costs. We have the direct materials. These are the parts used to build the skateboard or the scooter. We have the direct labor. This is the cost of the workers that put the skateboards and scooters together. And we have the manufacturing overhead, basically all the rest of the costs that are in the factory. So in a multiple product situation, like our business that manufactures skateboards and scooters, we have the two costs that are associated with direct cost. These are direct materials and direct labor. These are not a problem for us. These costs are directly specific to the product. In other words, if you look at direct material, you don't really have much of a question as to how much you spent on wheels for the scooters versus the skateboards, because you just would be able to see this number of wheels if you looked at the skateboards and the scooters. In other words, there's no real question about how we would divide that cost up. The same thing with direct labor. You just basically measure how much time the labor spent on making the scooters versus the skateboards. If they spent an hour manufacturing scooters and 4 hours manufacturing skateboards, then the direct labor is split up 1 hour versus 4 hours. It's not really a problem. However, manufacturing overhead is much more problematic because these costs are based on production in the entire factory. So how is it we're going to split the cost up between the two products? Let's review some of the costs that are associated with manufacturing overhead. As you recall, manufacturing overhead are costs that only occur in the factory or the plant, but they're not the direct materials and direct labor, so basically anything else in the factory. So utilities in the factory, insurance in the factory, property tax on the factory, the rental of the equipment that they use for making both the skateboards and scooters, any kind of indirect labor like security guards or maintenance personnel or supervisors that are in the factory but they're not building the products. And then indirect materials would be anything else like supplies that are used up in the factory but they're not used in the actual products they're making. Those are all examples of what you typically see as manufacturing overhead. Because these costs are so diverse and they're used throughout the entire factory, we need to come up with a way to split those costs up between the various products that we manufacture. To keep it simple, like we said, we're only doing two products. So in this lecture, what we're going to do is look at various options that we have to divide the manufacturing overhead up. Now, we're not worried about dividing up direct materials or direct labor, so the various options we look at are not to divide up all the costs, just the overhead costs. One option that we have to split up the manufacturing overhead between the scooters and skateboards is to use a single plant-wide overhead rate. This method is often called traditional costing. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to determine an activity in the factory that leads to more cost. In other words, more activity, more cost. So we have to determine what that activity is. Then we're going to use that to determine a single rate that we're going to apply to both the products that we have. And we'll look at that in some detail. So the first thing we'll do is determine an activity in the factory that leads to more costs. Right? So think of all the activities that are going on in the factory: moving materials around, purchasing materials, putting materials together, inspecting materials. All those things are going on, but we're going to think of what activity is kind of an overriding factor that would lead to more costs. One example that has been used for many decades is direct labor hours. Basically, the idea is this: the more time workers spend working, the more overhead is used up. One easy example would be to say that the more time the workers are in the factory working, the more utilities are used up, the more air conditioning is used up, the more electricity is used up. So there's a definite cause and effect relationship there. So notice I've said there's a cause and effect relationship. The more activity goes on, the more, in other words, in this case, the more direct labor hours are used, the more overhead costs we incur. They call that a cost driver because there's that cause and effect relationship. It's like driving a car. The more miles you drive, the more fuel you use. So the miles driven is the cost driver for the amount you pay for fuel. This cost driver is going to become our allocation base, and we'll see that in a second when we apply it to our formula that we're going to have. Just to let you know though, direct labor hours is not the only cost driver that you might find in a factory. You might also have something like machine hours. So the number of hours you run the machines, then the more overhead is allocated. So if we run the machines for 2 hours to build skateboards and 6 hours to build scooters, then you would give 6 hours worth of overhead to the scooters and only 2 to the skateboards. So it can be other cost drivers. You can actually have any cost driver that management determines is the best cause and effect relationship. These are the two most common that you'll see. So we're going to use that activity, that cost driver, direct labor hours, to allocate, or in other words, give some of the overhead to each of the product. In order to do this, we also need to estimate how much we're going to spend on overhead for the entire year. We're only going to come up with this rate once a year, or once every so often, but in most cases once a year. And then we're going to use that rate every time we do a job, so we'll continue to use it. So we'll take the estimated overhead cost for the year, and we'll take the cost driver that we decided to use as our allocation base, and we're going to use that to calculate what they call a predetermined overhead rate. The formula for getting the plant-wide overhead rate is to take the estimated annual overhead that we just calculated and divide it by the allocation base. We had determined that the estimate for manufacturing overhead for the year would be $1 million, and then our estimate for our allocation base was our cost driver, which was direct labor hours. We estimate 62,500 direct labor hours for the year, and so if we divide those two, we get $16 per direct labor hour. So in other words, $16 of overhead is given to any product that uses an hour of direct labor. So if we spend an hour manufacturing skateboards, we're going to give $16 of overhead to the skateboards. Let's look at this in more detail. So we'll look at a little spreadsheet here, and we'll have two jobs where we manufacture in job 101 skateboards and job 102 scooters. To manufacture the skateboards, it's going to take us 10 direct labor hours. To manufacture the scooters, it's going to take us 10 direct labor hours. So we're going to apply this to both the skateboards and the scooter jobs. Since the rate is $16 per direct labor hours, we just take 10 hours spent on labor for the skateboards times $16, and we get $160 of manufacturing overhead that we're going to give or allocate to the job 101. And since job 102 used the same number of direct labor hours, we'll use the same amount, $160 in manufacturing overhead. So the direct materials we used came basically from the specific raw material that was put into building the skateboards. It came to $450. We could have tracked that using a job cost system and seen, well, exactly how much material went in it. Then for the scooters, we see that we tracked direct materials went directly into the scooter, $650. The direct labor was $250 versus $150. When you calculate the total, you get $860 for the skateboards and $960 for the scooters. But what we want to see here is that this method of calculating a plant-wide overhead rate is really all about trying to determine how much overhead to give to each product. It's not going to have any implication on the materials or labor. Those are going to be what they are. Whatever you use for material and direct labor goes directly into those products. But it's how much we put in overhead that we're going to see is what is in question. This method is the plant-wide overhead rate. There's other methods that we'll look at. The plant-wide overhead rate, like anything else, has its benefits and its weaknesses. The benefits of using the plant-wide overhead rate, like I said, this is also commonly referred to as the traditional costing method, is that it's simple. We saw we only needed to do one calculation and then we could apply it to the jobs for the rest of the year. It's less expensive to implement than the other methods because it's so simple. It's not very complex. We don't need a lot of special software. And it does work well for products that have just one cost driver. So let's take a product where really the most important thing that you need is somebody to put it together. So that direct labor hour becomes really an overwhelming factor in the manufacturing process. In that kind of situation, this works well. However, there are some problems with the traditional costing method, and that is that, first of all, it doesn't account for complex manufacturing process with many kinds of activities and many kinds of cost drivers. So let's say you have a factory where there's some people that build the product, but you also have some robotics involved, and then you also have a lot of inspections, and then you also have a lot of material movement around the factory to bring things to different places. So there's so many activities going on that really one thing is not going to work as just a single cost driver. And because of that, if you have a situation where that's the case, using traditional costing could lead to cost distortion of the manufacturing overhead because you're trying to make everything fit under direct labor hours. Why would direct labor hours work well in the part of the factory where they use robotics? Might not. So that's some of the things that we need to consider before we look at the other cost methods.